So it's really nice to be here at the Keystone Policy Institute and with AJCI. I'm also here as part of a meeting that we're having on global fruit and vegetable crops and nutrition security. So I wanted to thank particularly the organizers of that meeting. I have learned so much in the past couple of days, and I'm going to extend beyond the fruit and vegetables today, but include it. And what I want to do, my purpose is to stretch your thinking a little bit. Maybe make you a little bit uncomfortable, be a little bit controversial, and hopefully have a really good discussion at the end of this session. So I'm going to talk about global food security in the 21st century. This is by no means a new problem. It's an age-old problem, but I want to put some just new thinking, new narratives, and an active dialogue. So just to set the context of what the 21st century looks like, we have 7.6 billion people on the planet today. We're moving towards 10 billion this century. And as depicted here, many more of those people are going to be living in urban environments. The disconnect between producers of food and consumers of food is going to be greater, so the accountability is more difficult, much more trade and so forth. And as these people in various countries increase their incomes, they're going to diversify diets towards meats, vegetable, fruits, and so forth, placing potentially more strain on the environment and on scarce water and soil resources. And then, of course, we have climate change in this century, which just puts a whole new dimension on everything that I'm going to talk about. So as we think about food security, I'm using the standard definition of 4 pillars. The availability is really the supply side, the pile of grain, how much we actually produce. Do we have enough physical quantities to feed the world? Access is even more important. Not just do people have physical access through our distribution systems, but do they have economic access? Do they have the incomes to purchase food, and is food affordable to them? The utilization is more medical in the sense, even when people have food, can their body utilize it? Can they contain the calories and so forth? Sanitation, safe drinking water, and so forth are very important so that the diarrheal diseases and other infectious diseases don't eliminate the benefits of the food. And then stability, do people have food at all times during the year and over many years? So we're not only talking about food, we're also talking about animal feed and now fuel. All of these demands are on the system. And we can think about staple crops, fruit and vegetables, which is the topic of our meeting, livestock, animal systems, and then even marine systems, which are an important animal product. And so I'm going to intertwine all of these. And I thought as a good organizing way of just presenting kind of a range of topics for you to chew on a little bit here, I'm going to talk about the seed, and then I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about how we think about systems in agriculture and food security, and then solutions. And I'm going to look to you to add some insight on the solutions side. So let's start with the seed. And again, an age-old problem. We can go back half a century when the Green Revolution started, and I define this as sort of the first food security challenge, because this period of time was one in which there was massive famines throughout Asia, very major climatic shocks that were going on, and very low yields in South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, widespread hunger. And this is when Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually through classical Mendelian breeding, redesigned crops, the open pollinated crops, wheat and rice, so that they would be short-statured, with the more ability to take up nutrients, allocate those nutrients to the grain as opposed to the leafy biomass, and thus double, essentially, yields of the staple grains. And so it really started with the seed, but the system then expanded to have fertilizer and irrigation and so forth. And these seeds were made publicly available to different countries through the international centers, which are shown here as IRRI for rice. But what was important, this wasn't just about availability of more grain and more volume, but it was about access, because it was scale neutral. If you had 1/8 of a hectare, you could still get the gains in yield, just as you would if you had 10 hectares. Okay, so it was scale neutral, and it was a technology that worked for the poor and by the poor. You know, many poor farmers increased their incomes and could afford to buy food, and also put food available in the market at lower cost. And so this was sort of an availability and access issue. And it was mainly focused around calories. And so this first food security challenge, we kind of met that, but yet we still have widespread malnutrition. This is a picture I took of a young girl in West Africa, and you know, most of Africa didn't benefit so much, at least initially, from the Green Revolution, because they don't, you know, their traditional crops are not wheat and rice. Corn is a cross-pollinated crop. It's very different, works through hybrids. And only 5% or less of Africa is irrigated, very heterogeneous systems. And so it wasn't really amenable to those big gains we saw in the early Green Revolution that Asia and Latin America had. I'm going to come back to this girl later on in the talk, but even when we think about pretty wealthy systems in China, I went to Jiangxi, which is one of the rice bowls in China where I took this picture. And these kids, you know, when you go to the rural areas of China now, you see young kids and their grandparents. Most of the parents are in the cities working. And these kids all come up and they're excited and everything. But what's interesting, when you go into the schools, you'll find that at recess, they don't necessarily go out and play. They're often just lie down and take a nap. And that should signal something's wrong, you know. Very widespread anemia, iron deficiency, and micronutrient deficiency and vitamin deficiencies. And so the second food security challenge is really about the nutritional content. Even though these kids have calories and their grandparents are good at giving them rice and the basic starchy staples, they don't have the micronutrients for early cognitive development as well as physical development. And so if you don't have that, especially in the first 2,000 days of life from the womb, first 2 years, you're cognitively stalled. I mean, you can imagine the development trajectory really being impeded by this kind of food security challenge. So it's the nutrition security that we're focused on in our meeting here. And it's not just applied to the global south. We see, this is actually our grocery store. You can't see it maybe from the back, but it's just rows and rows of diverse stuff, mainly high in starch, sugars, and saturated fats. And so not really high in nutrients, right? And so now we have that triple burden of obesity as well as malnutrition all in the same package. And a lot of the obese are in the low incomes. So then the third food security challenge for this century is obviously the environment and resources, the fresh water and soil resources, just the sheer toxicity loads of putting this much pesticides into the environment as well as climate change. And as we stress soils and take out nutrients from the soils, we also take out nutrients in the crop. So let me just give a few minutes on the climate change issue, which I think dominates a lot of our discussion today and is, of course, going to dominate a lot of the challenges in the future. Again, not a new issue. Back in the 1800s, a series of scientists were starting to define the greenhouse gas problem, and Arrhenius in 1896 actually even went as far as to predict a doubling of carbon dioxide from pre-industrial levels will warm the planet by 5 degrees C. And so pre-industrial is about 280, and we're at about 410 now, but we probably will reach 560 in this century. And so we'll hopefully not have his prediction panned out. But we do see, when we look at the data, these are, it starts in 1880, so Arrhenius time up until present, and 17 of the 18 warmest years since modern record keeping began have occurred since 2001. And so we're at this upward trajectory in terms of the temperature that we're actually seeing. So I did some work with one of the climate scientists from University of Washington, David Battisti, and I just want to give you a sense of where the projections put us in terms of growing season temperatures and what we're likely to face. So if you look at this, what we were essentially modeling was if you look at a distribution of growing season temperatures over the past century, you know, this is the average growing season temperature. We've seen some cold years and some warm years in the blue. And what many expect in the future is that the warmest years we've seen in the past are likely to be the average in the future. And this will increase temperature stress on crops, temperature-related moisture stress. We have extreme events, as we know. It's changing the whole dimension of pests and pathogens and how they're evolving and are likely to affect agriculture. It's taking away our ability to conserve crop genetic resources in situ. It's also having nutritional effects on our crop. And so, so this is sort of the standard, what's expected, but what if we go out of bounds in the future? For example, if our hottest year in the past is still colder than anything we see in terms of growing season temperatures in the future. So I'm going to show you some maps that we produced. If you're seeing this scenario, look for greens and yellows, and this is more dark oranges and reds. And so by the middle of the century, if we use just a very moderate emissions scenario, A1B, with all the climate models in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so an ensemble that captures both variability and mean, we see we're definitely going to go into this higher range, but a number of countries by mid-century are going to be completely out of range of anything they've known in the past in terms of growing season temperatures. And I focus on temperature because that's where the most certainty in these models are. And then by the end of the century, tropics and subtropics are just completely out of range. So how do we prepare for this sort of event? And do we rely on temperate systems like the United States and other temperate systems to actually supply grain and other commodities to the world? Some of our recent research actually shows that we'll also have a lot of extreme events that are more synchronous, meaning many temperate countries will go out of bounds. So how do we breed for this like climate change as well as for all of the biotic and abiotic stresses that we're likely to face? And I want to raise the topic of GMOs and genetic engineering with you. So when we looked at the Green Revolution, that was classical breeding. That was just what we've been doing since we domesticated agriculture, essentially. But in recent decades, we've had much more advanced genetic technology that has been available. We're now able to actually characterize the genomes of many species, and we can do this much more rapidly than we've ever done in the past. Identify the genes of interest, and through marker-assisted selection, actually do breeding this way. This does not involve foreign gene inserts, but it involves just knowing what's in that genome. And we've also developed, since the mid-1990s, what many call GMOs, or genetic engineering, the insertion of a gene from one species into another. So just to get a range of what my audience, how many of you are opposed to GMOs, pretty much adamantly opposed? Don't feel bad about raising your hand, most audiences, okay. So, and this is a technology that we see. The reason I say GMOs in question marks versus GE, a lot of geneticists don't like to use genetically modified organisms as a term because we've been modifying our genetics since domestication. But the term GMO is what's widely used. And so the question is, do we need that kind of technology as opposed to just using the wide diversity of genetic material we have in our system and we are trying to preserve in terms of classical breeding? So as we breed for higher yields and these attributes, we start losing other attributes. We start losing some of the nutritional qualities and other things. And so we can see what we're gaining, but we often can't see what we're actually losing. So I want to focus on some of the biotic, the pest, weeds, and diseases. And I want to focus on this because, in my view, some of these pest problems are some of the worst in terms of pesticide loads and so forth. About 30 to 40% of the potential yields and the potential volume we might have in agriculture is lost to these biotic stresses. And most of those losses are actually in the developing world, the global south, where they have continuous non-fallow, season. And right now we're using approximately 1 billion pounds of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides in the United States alone, and about 6 billion pounds throughout the world. And so, we're putting a lot of toxics in that are going all over the place. They're going up to the Arctic, they're going to the ocean, they're everywhere, okay? So, again, not a new issue. Rachel Carson obviously wrote Silent Spring way back in 1962. And at that time, she was really alarmed at the pesticide loads that were in our environment and the rapid growth in pesticide development. So Monsanto and other agricultural companies were really developing this chemical industry very fast, including DDT that was defoliating in Vietnam later on and so forth. So the development of chemical treatments was really very rapid. And she exposed it. It started becoming a topic of public policy. And so what are the options then for these control of these biotic stresses? Farm management is the most obvious one, and I know a number of you are farmers and you think about intercropping or crop rotations, ways to treat and manage pests and pathogens. But through breeding, there's also the creation of host plant resistance. Can you get the plant itself to be resistant to that crop? And we've been doing that through classical breeding forever, just selecting those varieties, and that's why we need this genetic diversity. But also through now genetic engineering, taking a bacteria and putting it into a corn plant or whatever. So the main genetic engineered crops are insect resistance, particularly Bt, herbicide resistance using Roundup Ready and glyphosate is the chemical, viral bacterial resistance, then nutritional qualities, food qualities, for example, inserting vitamin A into rice, the golden rice, or trying to have apples not brown, when you store them. And then climate tolerance. Heat tolerance, drought tolerance involves many genes, and it's thought to be easier to have this quantitative trait dealt with through genetic engineering. Now, I put Monsanto up there because Monsanto is the company that is sort of the flash. It actually doesn't really exist anymore because Bayer just bought it out, as you probably know. But Monsanto, I think it's important to note that Monsanto was actually developing a lot of the chemicals that we used in agriculture. And then when Rachel Carson and a lot of the discussion really revolved around getting rid of these toxics in the environment, they did feel the pressing need to get host plant resistance and to go into this area of biotechnology and genetic engineering. This was also being done at universities and a number of labs, and it kind of came to Monsanto through the larger research establishment. But I think where the public doesn't really understand is that Monsanto was never, and other chemical companies were never that clear about the fact that as they developed these biological treatments, it would offset their chemical treatments. They didn't really own up to the chemical problem. And they still wanted to sell the chemicals, of course. So, I think the public never really appreciated how much of an offset this could actually be and what the trade-off really was involved. Going back to our fruit and vegetable meeting here, we have a number of genetic engineering resistance that has been widely favorable in papaya. Half the papaya crop in Hawaii was facing a viral problem, and they essentially just vaccinated it, and now most of the papaya that we get is genetically engineered. In Uganda and parts of Kenya, we have bananas that have a bacterial resistance or bacterial problem with now a genetic engineering solution. And in Bangladesh with eggplants, they also have a borer that they need Bt resistance for. And they went from spraying up to 100 times a season down to a few times in terms of their pesticide loads. Now, this was also tried in India and Philippines, but the anti-GMO lobby has pretty much shut that down. And so, again, this kind of trade-off, I think, is interesting. So we now have about 190 million hectares planted throughout the world in about 24 countries. And just to point out, United States is the highest one. And within the United States, and I'll focus a couple of comments on the United States, both the Bt resistance and for corn and the herbicide tolerance in soy are some of the major ones. And so I'll be pretty brief here, but Bt is used in organic insecticides, and it's non-toxic, and it's used in organic agriculture. But it's also bred into crops, directly into corn or into cotton, for example, and without the use of spraying. And so the National Academy of Sciences produced a report a couple of years ago where they showed really a 10-fold decrease in insecticide use in corn over the 15 years that Bt has been used. And so you're seeing a dramatic reduction in insecticide use. Herbicide tolerance really took the more toxic herbicides and replaced them with glyphosate, which is a non-toxic herbicide. So it is classified as non-toxic by the EPA. It doesn't persist in the environment, and it permits no-till practices. So you can spray the herbicides and not have the tillage. And when you look at some of the concerns that are developing around glyphosate, and I'm sure some of you are paying attention to these, it can be expensive, and this was a way for Monsanto to sell a new chemical. It's not always appropriate. It's often overused, and if you overuse it, you'll get resistance. And now there's this probable cause of cancer, and studies are unfolding in terms of that. But it has allowed for no-till, and so I've met a number of large sort of sustainable agricultural operations where they want to be organic, but they can't be organic with GE, but they can't do no-till without Roundup Ready. So these are these kind of trade-offs, inherent trade-offs we have in our food system here. What's interesting when you go back and look at over 1,700 peer-reviewed papers, scientific papers, 5 National Academy reports, and so forth, there's really no evidence that genetic engineered crops are more or less risky to humans or animals than conventional crops. And so the evidence is not showing that we have a major threat to human health and the environment, but it's no silver bullet. You know, it really depends on management. And again, not a new issue. Back in the 1850s, there was, clear recognition that planting a single crop over time is going to lead to, pest and pathogen outbreaks. And scientists predicted if you overuse BT, overuse Roundup Ready, you are going to get resistance to those weeds and to those insects. And so farm management turns out to be really key. It's just not the technology alone. The overuse of a single practice over time has caused this, and much to the encouragement, I think, of the industries that sell the seed. And the EPA has recommended refuges that you have lines of or rows of crops that are susceptible to pests, so they go on those crops instead of becoming resistant to the modern technology. But those have now been relaxed. I was just in Iowa, and one of my friends who's been farming all his life said, none of the farmers use refuse. They all just crop over and over and over again, and so you are starting to see resistance. So regardless of where you sit on this issue, I really recommend this book by Mark Linus that just came out this year. Mark Linus was the founder as well as a long-term activist of the anti-GMO movement. He was really the one that spawned that movement that became a very broad international movement from the UK. And when challenged to and accused of just claiming things without scientific evidence, he went back and said, okay, I'm just going to put all the scientific evidence together and I'm going to show you what my claims are. But he went in and he couldn't really find the scientific evidence to back him up. So he said over time he really began to think, was it really possible that not just Greenpeace, where he was very much affiliated, but pretty much the entire environmental movement and indeed polite, progressive, liberal society in general has got the GMO issue flat out wrong. And he says this because he knows everybody wants the same thing. We all want more sustainable agriculture, less toxics in the environment and so forth. But why these two sides, is what he's saying in his book. It's kind of an interesting read, actually. He also writes on global climate change, and he always really disparages people that are climate naysayers. But he said, we can't really criticize the global warming skeptics for denying climate scientific consensus when we ignore the same consensus on both the safety and the beneficial use of genetic engineering. And there he's talking about lack of toxics. So I put this up just to fuel some discussion. We certainly have had some good discussion within our meeting here, and Sylvia Rowe, who gave a nice talk yesterday, really said it's not about the scientific evidence, because a lot of people don't even know how to interpret this, but she said it's about trust and transparency, and those are the major issues. And so I have really enjoyed the discussions, and she also said, we should never overestimate people's knowledge. People don't understand all this genetics. But we can't underestimate their intelligence, and so can't put people down for not understanding it all. And so I think we have a longer discussion here on this. And of course, all this GMO stuff is almost being obsolete by the CRISPR, the whole CRISPR gene editing technology, which is going like this, And what's interesting, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not going to describe this picture to you. But you can, edit genes, silence genes, and so forth pretty simply with this technology, the Cas9 technology. How it will affect the GE debate, I think, is going to be interesting. I will give a glass of wine at the end to anyone who knows the full name of CRISPR. I'll ask you at the end. But what's interesting about the GE debate, I think it's just yesterday, I think the UK said they're going to ban it as a GMO. It's just in the same technology. And in the United States, we're not even regulating it because it's not foreign gene insert. So it's like we're really far apart on this, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And we know, again, what are we removing and how is this going? How transparent can this all be? I think it's going to be an interesting row. So the seed is so complex, but it's so essential to the whole shebang that we're talking about. So now I want to do a fairly abrupt shift and talk about systems and system thinking. I'm not going to stick with the corn-soybean system in the US. I want, for those of you that are, have heard about that too much, I'm going to just talk about totally different parts of the world. And I want to talk about vegetable and fruit systems in West Africa, where I work, because that's our nature of our conference, and also animal protein systems, particularly in fisheries. So the area where I work in West Benin looks like this, and many really poor agricultural areas look like this, agricultural dependent. And I took this picture driving from Benin into Niger, and I could actually see the Niger River not too far away. But this was so desperately poor and rain-fed. And you have 8 months of the season where nothing can be grown, and 4 months of the season where they're growing a variety of basic staple crops. But there's no energy to lift that water to the area that they need to have it. And so we've been working in a West African yam culture, and this is what yams look like, just a big starchy staple. Median income less than $1. They're super poor areas, less than $1 a day, 60-70% of household income spent on food. And a third of the kids are malnourished, really high disease burden, especially in that dry season. And so how do we think about a season? This would be extreme protein malnourishment here, and they also have extreme micronutrient malnourishment. So we're working in this area here in northern Benin, but this is the whole Sudan Sahel area is extremely dry. Less than 5% irrigated, as I said, and so extremely poor. So what our intervention, can we think of using all that sun now with new technology and solar-powered drip irrigation to actually reduce poverty by planting fruits and vegetables in these systems that can be used for local consumption? So we teamed up with the Solar Electric Life Fund, which is the energy source, and ICRISAT, which is one of the international centers, the Dryland Crop Center, to provide the seed technology. And then our Center on Food Security did the evaluation of this system. So I'll just tell you quickly what the system is. It's really a small-scale system where you have a small-scale PV array, and this is directly coupled. There's no batteries involved. It can pump water at great depths and across large horizontal distances. And Africa does have water. They just don't have a means to get it around. It's very distributed. Put it in a reservoir and then irrigate through this drip irrigation. So we're talking about very small areas, small arrays of solar. They're simple, they're safe, you can immune to oil prices, and a wide range of specs. So you can make this to suit the community, essentially. Direct coupling, no batteries. And then with the drip irrigation, you're using water as efficiently as possible and then having crops throughout the year. And new agricultural products, ones that are actually nutritious in the system. And so I have to credit my collaborator, Jen Burney at UC San Diego, because she's the master, she's a physics PhD that designed these systems and is the mastermind. But we have used these systems in these women's cooperatives, And women are so essential for food security in Africa. They're the ones that feed the families, they're the ones that make up most of agriculture, but also when you look at poverty throughout the world, 70% of the rural poor are women. So, this has been a huge focus of ours, and this is what one of these systems looks like. So we got the water turned on, everything's working, and how do we know? So we really feel like these all sound good, but you have to do the evaluation. Compare these systems to communities that don't have the technologies or households that have access and don't have access in a match set comparison. So RCT is a randomized control trial, and we have rolled this out for over 10 years and scaled it up incrementally. And so what have the results been in this kind of a system? The rates of return are enormous, about 45 to 60% return on investment from these when you're thinking about just income generation from these systems. We've been measuring food consumption, nutrition, food security, where they sell the crops to. They mainly sell to the local market. They put it in at 5 in the morning. It's all gone by 5:15 in the morning. And it's consumed locally. People are poor, but they will pay to have more nutritious foods. And the importance of women's groups, because they share risk, they share knowledge, literacy. And by far the highlight of my profession over several decades has been on the educational side of this. And I was traveling in Benin to the sites and was asked to go into the school as we were waiting for our collaborators. And we went in, and I was introduced. So here is Roz, she's the PI on this project. The kids just looked at me like, huh? I did notice there 50% of the kids were girls, though, in the classroom, which was awesome. Then they said Obama, and the kids kind of went wild, And then they said, this is, no, they said first that she's from Stanford, blank look. Then they said Obama, more of like, then they said that I was part of this system. And they were really interested, because what they had done was actually create a curriculum that was teaching the kids how to read, how to do math, how to do physics, how to go into the fields and calculate things. And all of a sudden, kids took pride in agriculture. This was not like this drudgery thing. They thought, I could be a mason, I could be a solar supply person. All of a sudden, they saw their future in a really different way. And so the importance that we saw of having more high-valued performance, these solar arrays are more costly, but a high rate of return. That's not like the treadle pumps that were broken by the side of the fields because the water was quite deep there. So poor countries don't like junk, and if it really serves their needs, it starts scaling up. So that's one example. I'll quickly go through my second example and then open it up for questions. And I like this thinking because it always takes me to somewhere that I didn't start in. And I didn't really start that project thinking about the educational benefits. And as girls go into education, they're likely to have fewer kids. And, and all of a sudden I'm seeing this development trajectory that just totally changed my mind about development. And these kids are eating these vegetables and fruits. So in those first 2,000 days, cognitively, they are going to be better developed than their parents. And so to me, it was really, these kind of things are really promising. That's why I love this conference I'm at. Let's go into animal protein. By far the fastest growth, this is food commodity growth over the past a couple of decades here. By far the fastest growth has been in aquaculture, farm fish. And there's about 660 different species of fish farmed around the world, shellfish, finfish, all sorts of things. China is the global leader, about 2/3 of global volume and about half of trade. But this is what they look like. These are finfish in a marine system. These are the traditional carp. These are more modern systems. You have so much diversity in this system for animal protein, and a little bit more resilience to climate being in water as opposed to on land and so forth. So there's a big area that we can talk about here, in addition to having high micronutrient content and high protein content. And so, but they do have environmental problems. And when you look at the system aspect, especially the fish that you and I probably eat, salmon, shrimp, and so forth, tuna, they're using wild fish in feeds through fish meal and fish oil. And so the system component can actually deplete a wild fishery for the sake of the aquaculture. And this is one of the problems that I've been working on that I wanted to just talk about today. So what are some of the solutions? We go back to kind of the seed. They're using now advanced genomics, marker-assisted breeding to actually turn salmon from a carnivore into a herbivore. And so, trout and salmon will develop enteritis when they eat too much soybeans, but they've been able to overcome that and breed for being resistant to enteritis. So you can see, again, these genetic tools coming in here. And now something much more controversial will step up a stage, because just last month there was a controversy in the UK in particular, the modification of canola or rapeseed to have the long-chain fatty acid component, so that when you feed that to fish, you're actually getting that N3 beneficial fatty acid instead of the soybeans, which would be like eating a hamburger, okay? So nutritionally, you got some trade-offs here. And people didn't like the fact that this was genetically modified feed. On the other hand, it could save wild fisheries. So this is one of the trade-offs, again, that we're talking about. More controversial, I think, is that we have genetically engineered salmon actually in the market. It was introduced into Canada last year. It's a salmon gene from king into, from one species into another, and grows much faster and so forth. But biologically, can we contain this? There's a little bit more we could talk about on that one. And let's go one step further in talking about innovation and meeting, getting around these roadblocks. Callista is a company in our neighborhood in California, and what they are doing for salmon feeds is they're looking at the incredible rapid growth in natural gas that we have in the United States and trying to harness the flare-offs from the natural gas pipelines, take that through a process of methanogenesis, create that methane into a fish protein. And this fish protein, so this is their first commercial plant that's going into this fish, okay? And so now we're taking the waste from an energy sector that is booming, and we're using it as a feed in a booming animal protein sector. Okay, I'm stretching your thinking, and this is, okay, so let's look at all the opportunities on the table here. It's much higher protein, actually, than even fish meal from wild fish. So I'll just kind of end here. There's certainly the power of innovation and maybe the risks of innovation to some extent. But really, the weakness in broad generalizations about anything, because what I tried to do is just give you such diverse, you go into the field anywhere. I work all over the world. You go into these systems, they're so diverse and so interesting, and there's all these opportunities for improvement, actually. And most of what I actually learned from farmers, and secondarily from my colleagues here in this room at the conference. And the importance of recognizing just these complexity of these systems. And so I'll just end with a couple of notes, and then I'd love your thoughts on this. When we think about solutions, the first one is on sequencing. We have all these constraints that we're trying to solve to make sustainable food systems for food and nutrition security, and and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, there's a lot on our plate now, as the world kind of gets smaller with more and more people. But what about sequencing? Systems and complexity thinking is great, but governments really can only do a few things really well at one time. If they have a list, if you develop a list of 100 things you're going to do, it's like, where do you start? How do you actually operationalize that? And so, the Green Revolution, they started with the seed, then developed the system and kind of went up from there. That was a good example of that. In some countries, they'll start with just getting agriculture right, getting the incentive structure right for farmers to get going. Sometimes it's getting their macroeconomic policy right, because if they've messed up exchange rates, interest rates, it just kills everything in the economy. And so it is really country specific, but this idea of sequencing is something we might want to keep in mind. The second, I've talked about the public sector as well as the private sector, and their little dance is interesting. And we always say public-private partnerships, but some of these partnerships are not so good. Like United States, right? And we go through these ebbs and flows, right, where the government regulates the industry, and then it becomes a little bit too close to the industry, and so where do we want to actually be on that? Public sector has a big role to play in innovation. Public sector breeding programs, we've been talking about that, could be much more directed at fruits and vegetables than just starchy staples and sugars and so forth, and fats. But they also can create the incentives for production through the economic incentives as well as the oversight and regulating what's out there. I think we've noticed, and we've talked a lot about it in this meeting, is that the government tends to be siloed. The Department of Agriculture just wants higher yields, more pile of grain, they can report that. They don't necessarily want more nutrition, which leads to better education and better health outcomes. We don't even measure the health outcomes directly from our agricultural policies. And so how do we reduce those silos, not just in this country, but in every country? And then thinking about technology transfer from countries like the United States to other countries, how we deal with intellectual property rights, and how we have companies, private sector companies, participate, because a lot of the innovation is in private sector companies. How can they transfer to countries that really need the technologies but may not have access to IP? So we can have a discussion about that. I think one of the themes that I'm hearing coming out of our meeting here, putting the private public sector, whatever they're doing, to one side, is the importance of diversity. And if it's not just what we're growing in our fields, but having the crop diversity and the varietal turnover that we need to avoid that resistance and the biotic and buildup and so forth is incredibly important. So focusing on diversity, not just for yields, but the consumer side, taste, culture. What are we, we're not just doing agriculture for the sake of agriculture, we're doing it for food. What kind of food do we really want out there? And the last one I'll put on which again might be controversial for some of you. I think when I look at all of this, I'm usually a really optimistic person. Sometimes I can get so overwhelmed by just thinking of 10 billion people on this planet, because the more people we have, and so revisiting narratives on population control is my last point. The more people, if we're going to go 7.6 billion to 8 billion to 9 billion to 10 billion, okay, so it's not just that there's more mouths to feed. You have to employ all those people. As you're employing these people, you need economic growth. Economic growth is going to lead to pollution and climate change and resource use and so forth. And you need to house all these people and then govern them. Most of our food security problems today are in countries with conflict. And so let's put population back on the table for discussion globally. But how do we think about it? When we look at just where the populations are going to grow in this century, most of the growth is actually going to be in Africa. By the middle of the century, over half of the additional people in the world are going to be in Africa. By the end of the century, about 95% of the additional people are expected to be in Africa. Still, the populations in Asia are obviously larger in amounts. But it's not just Africa. It goes way beyond that. So how should we be thinking about this? I would like to reframe the discussion more around women's reproductive health and rural health clinics and linking this to the food security and nutrition security elements. And when we think about it, and I've said a number of times, just reproductive health and what a woman eats when she has a baby in their womb determines cognitive, physical ability. And I heard at this meeting also apparently determines whether the kid likes vegetables when they come out. I don't know if that's true, but it kind of makes sense. But it's really important to take this step and focus on women and what's good for society anyway, okay? And I'll end with kind of a story. I do a lot of my work in Indonesia, and I'll kind of end where I started my career, which was in Indonesia. I think Jerry also did your early career in Indonesia. When you went to Indonesia in those early days, President Suharto, who was known to be an extremely corrupt general, authoritarian and so forth, when he came into power, he actually did care about the rural society, because he knew if he didn't get that right, he wasn't going to stay in power very long. And he not only invested in agricultural technology, but he invested in rural health clinics. And Indonesia and Java in particular had one of the most densely populated, rapid population growth in the world. And so what you see everywhere is these signs that say, all over the streets, two kids only, and they say girls or boys, just the same. And it's just this mantra. It created a whole new value and discussion in the culture around 2 kids, let's get married, have those kids right away, and then take care of them, and that's it, you know. And I did notice when I was doing my field work in those early days, I was married, but I didn't have kids, and I was in the field a lot. So people would say, initially, they'd say, hi, how are you, already married? Yes, how many kids? You know, this all went with 2 seconds, you know. And I didn't have kids. And then they'd say, oh, then the whole discussion went from the farming that I was trying to learn about to my sex life and my, you know, and I thought, okay, this is not gonna work. So I started bringing a picture of my sister's child around, saying, no, I have one son, and, you know, but the value system had changed so much around this. And so it was really interesting, you know, how can we get that value system around smaller families and healthier families and better nutrition? And I think that if a really corrupt Muslim general can take on women's reproductive health, I think there's hope for us all. So with that, I will end the conversation. But I did ask, okay, who knows CRISPR? Okay, you're in our, but there's, okay. Okay, Colin, okay, go ahead, go ahead. Because I'll buy you a glass of wine or a beer after this.
I only know last 2.
Okay. Clustered regulatory interspace short palindromic repeats. And I had to put that up because I thought somebody's going to ask me what a CRISPR is, and I didn't want to have to actually go there. So anyway, thank you and welcome conversation.